Hi, I'm Chris Ray, and welcome to the third of 3 video lectures about Mo Yan's novel Frog. Please also check out the brief video introduction I made to Mo Yan's life and works. I mentioned in that first lecture about this novel that there's a type of poetics of profusion that we get, and that frogs have many different offspring. In this video lecture, I want to argue that in writing about the one-child policy and using the motif of frogs, Mo Yan is also making a comment about creativity. So frogs do a type of natural reproduction, you could say. But an artist who is writing words on a page is doing a type of artifice. There is an art of reproduction at work in Mo Yan's Frog. At the end of that last video lecture, I posed this question: why is this existentialist philosopher Sartre writing about flies? And why is this Chinese novelist Mo Yan writing about frogs? What are the effects? What are the implications of these particular motifs? As with all motifs, the symbolism can be multiple. You could have, Lord of the Flies, this sense that humans can become inhuman in certain environments, and that they will have this tendency to degrade. Flies benefit from violence and feed on corpses. Animals can be invoked to belittle human beings. We see that in Liu Cixin's novel The Three-Body Problem, in which the aliens tell humans, "You're bugs." In Life and Death Are Wearing Me Out, Mo Yan presents human life as rather absurd, in which we have a human being who dies and is reincarnated as various types of barnyard animals and other beasts. And for him, things just keep getting worse and worse. And so if you have a human soul in an animal body, where is your humanity exactly? One type of symbolism that Sartre was drawing on was that flies are a prick to the conscience. They keep biting us, or they keep annoying us. They keep reminding us of our faults. They keep reminding us that we are only mortal. Or take dogs. There's a whole philosophical school of thought called cynicism, where these cynics view themselves as essentially watchdogs of humanity, and that their job is partly to hound immoral people into better behavior. Here we see Diogenes with a lamp that he's going to use to find a moral man. So the question with all of these different animals is, what creative or imaginative associations might we make with this particular creature? In the 2 previous video lectures, I gave several examples of the type of symbolism that Mo Yan attaches to frogs. Here I want to argue that Frog is also a novel about the act of creation. We have a lot of self-references and kind of commentaries on the act of creation. So we'll look at some examples from other contexts as well. We also have a novel that calls attention to its own form by including a play and including letters. I'm not going to give any examples here, but I'll just note in passing that Mo Yan is also extremely fond of self-reference. You find this in many of his different novels. I mentioned before that frogs are a type of symbol of hyper-reproductive capacity, and I believe that Mo Yan is making some implicit and explicit links of this to the author himself. Humans reproduce, animals like frogs reproduce, and artists reproduce as well. So I see Frog as a tribute to and a demonstration of storytelling fecundity. And I want to give one example about the inclusion of Don Quixote as an intertext. Don Quixote is essentially being presented as a type of frog. We discussed letters in the last video lecture, and if we delve in a little deeper, we can see that we have multiple layers of narration within this novel. We have Tadpole's letters to Sensei, in which he discusses stories about and told by Gugu. So Gugu is a storyteller. People tell stories about her. Sometimes these stories conflict. We also have discussion of the play that he plans to write and adapt even from these letters. And then he also discusses events that are not directly related to Gugu's story or his own creation. Some of the stories that Tadpole tells are about master sculptors who create these little figurines, these dolls that look like children. And although I won't say much about it in this video lecture, I would mention in passing that Tadpole often represents himself as being a dreamer. And dreams, as we know, are a different state of consciousness. Finally, at the end of the novel, we have an entire play. In Act 4 of that play, Frog, we have a dialogue between Gugu and Tadpole, in which Gugu asks, "What do you mean by tumbling out of my mouth? Every word Gugu says is carefully considered." Then she points to the manuscript in Tadpole's hand. "Is that your play?" Tadpole replies modestly, "Yes." Gugu asks, "What is it called?" Tadpole says, "Wah." So at this moment, we have a play within a letter within a novel. And we even have Gugu make an allusion to a kind of stream of consciousness type of narration. So this is a very meta moment. Meta meaning of a creative work referring to itself or to the conventions of its genre. Self-referential. In Chinese, this would be expressed as hou shi. And you could think of various examples like meta-narration, where you're telling a story about storytelling itself. Meta-theater, where you have performance about performance itself. You have meta-cinema, where you have films or filmmaking about filmmaking or film form. And you could think of plenty of examples of meta-structure. So a famous example would be Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, in which you have a play within a play. We have real actors from real life playing fictional actors in the story world of the play, performing a play for a fictional audience. And we even have the fictional audience within the play watching the play within the play. In the graphic arts, you have paintings within paintings, where we have the frame of the canvas, and then we have another frame within that, and maybe even another frame within that as well. And with all of this kind of concentric framing, one of the things that it does is it calls attention to the artifice of the work itself. And it doesn't have to be just one painting within the painting. You can have as many as you can fit within the frame. Or dreams upon dreams, dreams within dreams, dreams about dreams. This is a type of imaginary with a long and very rich history. You could think of Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. I fell asleep and dreamt that I was a butterfly, and I fluttered about happily. And then when I woke up and discovered myself human, I really started to wonder, am I a man who dreamt about being a butterfly, or am I a butterfly who is dreaming about being a man? Many centuries later, The Dream of the Red Chamber is a canonical work in which we have many different dream narratives within a dream frame. So these and other works testify to, even within the Chinese literary and philosophical tradition, many writers and thinkers have been very interested in how you can determine the difference between illusion and reality and when they start to blur, and also about these different structures of perception and expression. This is no doubt the only video lecture in history that follows that previous slide with this current one, but unfortunately this is the reality that we face in 2021, where there is a metaverse looming in which a corporation is going to bring everything within its meta realm. So it's going to be the ultimate encapsulation of human experience, virtual and otherwise. But let's not leave things there. How about this joke about the form of the joke? To bring things a little closer to the case of China, meta cinema is tremendously important in contemporary Chinese cinema. And I would cite the example of Zhang Yimou's film adaptation of Yu Hua's novel To Live. In To Live the film, we have the filmmaker adding a new type of storytelling within the storytelling, in which we have our main character is essentially a balladeer, and one who is using a type of proto-cinema. Yingxi is both the term for shadow puppetry, and it was the earliest term for what we now call 电影, or electric shadows. Before we had electricity, we would be using a flame or other light source to do these projections and do this type of storytelling. There is one moment in Frog where Gugu inadvertently enables a rapist by giving him a vasectomy. So she's enforcing the family planning policy so he can no longer have children, and therefore he goes around raping different women. And one of the rapist victims is described like this. Her lashes danced like butterfly wings, butterflies. Her eyes could talk, and anyone who saw her would believe that if the film director Zhang Yimou discovered her, she'd be a hotter commodity than Gong Li or Zhang Ziyi ever were. So of course we're partly talking about an unintended consequence of implementing the one-child policy, but there's also a type of meta and auto-commentary going on here, because Zhang Yimou and Mo Yan had collaborated on adapting Red Sorghum the novel into Red Sorghum the film, and Gong Li starred in that adaptation. I would note in passing that vasectomy also appears as a plot point in a different novel covered in this course, Yu Hua's Brothers. So what I am drawing attention to here is that Frog nests multiple types of creativity within the novel form. And not all of these types of creativity are necessarily literary. For example, we have these artisanal handcrafts. These abstract representations of children become objects that women go to and kind of praying for their own children, for real children. So they become vehicles for conveying this longing. But there's an interesting moment that occurs in the sequence relating to the master sculptors, where one character is telling a story and then Tadpole tiptoes out to get his camera and returns to take a picture of the master. And he discovers that this representation of a child looks a lot like the artist himself. So the artist is creating a type of self-image. But if we look at that passage more closely, we can see a lot of types of meta copying going on, in which we have one character telling a story to Tadpole, the narrator, who creates a photo replica of an artist who is creating a self-image. And we're told elsewhere that this is an image that the artist may have seen in a dream. Later in the novel, we have a conversation between Gugu and Tadpole about creation and replication. And so Gugu asks Tadpole, why does the word for frogs, wah, sound exactly like the word for babies, wah? Why is the first sound a newborn baby makes almost an exact replica of a frog's croak? And why is the ancestor of all humans called Niwa, like the wah for frog? Doesn't that prove that our earliest ancestor was a frog and that we have evolved from her? There are multiple versions of the Niwa myth, and it's in one of the later versions that she makes human beings out of mud, just like a sculptor. So this is a creation myth. A few years after Mo Yan wrote the novel Frog, Stephen Chow created The Mermaid, in which we have a different type of creation myth. Tourists in this low-budget museum are given a spurious history about how humans evolved from fish, so fish are our ancestors. These objects end up having multiple meanings. They're not just incorporated into a type of creation myth, very speculatively, but they also become talismans. It's something that Gugu tries to use to purge her guilt. It's almost like a voodoo folk practice being invoked here. Gugu herself is also represented as an artist who is very talented at her job, but she's also a barren artist who is childless herself. We don't know why she doesn't fulfill her biological destiny, but she is a superhuman midwife that supposedly is as fecund as a frog in the sense of delivering the entire community into being. She is equally effective as a fanatical enforcer of this population control policy, so she enacts a type of creative destruction, you could call it. And when she is suffering in the aftermath, she turns into the symbolic world as a tortured soul seeking some type of redemption. So we might well ask why Moyen then throws Don Quixote into this novel. Don Quixote is a canonical delusional figure, someone who is an ordinary man who thinks he's a chivalrous knight. He's on a mission to save the damsel in distress of his mind. And he also suffers from a persecution complex, in that when he encounters a windmill, he thinks it's a monster from a storybook and he wants to take it down. If we pursue Moyen's logic, we could take Don Quixote the novel as being frog-like, and that this is the novel that spawned 10,000 novels, or was the handmaiden to 10,000 novels. It is one of the most influential literary works ever written, and it is also a work that is highly self-referential, highly meta-literary, meaning it does kind of meta-commentary on many literary genres, so it kind of deconstructs its own form as it goes along. So I believe that Moyen is partly paying tribute to not just Sartre, but also to the creative power of Cervantes' work. We can find many Chinese myths and genres and storytelling styles in Moyen's work as well. But I think we can take Don Quixote to be a type of metafictional illusion, this motif that has many different possible meanings. Now, just give a couple of examples here. One is with characterization. Gugu is kind of a mock heroic delusional figure. She has missionary zeal. Her connection to reality is very problematic. Don Quixote also appears in the novel in a type of fall from grace. It's this very degraded copy that we see with these cafe employees. Tadpole himself is also something of a handmaiden to Gugu's story, in that he represents some of her self-narrative, but he is ultimately bringing her story out into the world. He confronts writer's block, but he ultimately produces many Gugus again and again in multiple forms. So the story proper ends with the procreative urge, and that Tadpole, who is a letter writer, has told the story once in prose and wants to recreate it again for the stage. And so we could say that the narrator himself is kind of mimicking this compulsive behavior that we see in frogs, we see in Gugu, and in the doll makers. So again, we have a convergence of multiple types of storytelling. And I believe this is an imperfect analogy, but if you think about metamorphosis, right, how is metamorphic rock made? Well, you have different sedimentary layers, perhaps for sedimentary rock, but then when you add heat and compression, you turn them into a different type of rock altogether. And so I would ask, do you think that there's a type of compression or transformation going on that is more than just a repetition or accretion of different layers? To me, Moyen's novel is one that has its own procreative urge, and that it wants to represent the act of creation as one that can be simultaneously unique and kind of modeled on various things. It can be modeled on foreign or Chinese sources. It's something that can be replicable, and it's like inexhaustive. It could be reducible. You could shrink things down and compress them into just one motif or one image, but it is ultimately complex and ultimately productive. A frog is singular, but it can contain multitudes.